My name is Hannah Bennett, and on the night of my 18th birthday, my father threw a $100 bill at my chest and told me to get out because he was done paying for another man's mistake. The bill hit my sweater and slid to the kitchen floor, and he stood there in the doorway waiting for me to cry, because that was the whole point. The $100 was supposed to be the last cruelest thing he ever gave me. I bent down. I picked it up. And then I did the one thing he had not planned for in 18 years of keeping score. I smiled, and I handed him a sealed envelope I'd been keeping for a very long time. "I know," I said, "and the father you swore was dead just walked in. I want to tell you what was in that envelope, and I want to tell you who came through the door, and most of all, I want to tell you what I chose to do in the 60 seconds after his face drained of every drop of color. Because that choice cost me more than he ever did." Welcome back to Hidden Family Revenge, where ordinary people meet the moment that finally asks everything of them and answer it standing up. Drop a comment, tell me where you're watching from, and please subscribe. I grew up in Harlow Cove, a fishing town in Maine where everyone knows your business before you do, and where I was known, from the time I could walk, as Ray Bennett's stepdaughter. Not his daughter, his stepdaughter. In a town that small, the prefix does real work. It tells people you're a story before you're a person. My mother married Ray when she was already pregnant with me, and the arithmetic was not hard, and the town did the math out loud for 18 years. I learned early that I cost something. I don't mean love. I mean I learned it as a number, the way some kids learn their times tables. A pair of school shoes was a look across the dinner table. A field trip permission slip was a sigh, and a wallet opened too slowly. By the time I was 10, I kept a ledger in my head, a running tally of everything I used up just by existing in that house, and I paid it down the only way a child can. I got small, and I got useful. I did the dishes before anyone asked. I never wanted seconds. I got a job bussing tables at 14 and a real one at the bakery at 16, and every dollar I earned I treated like a payment against a debt I'd been born already owing. I thought if I could just get the number low enough, one day Ray would look at me and see a daughter instead of a bill. I want you to understand that, because it's the whole tragedy of the first 17 years of my life. I was trying to buy my way into being wanted. You can't. Nobody can. But God. I tried. I need to be fair to Ray, because the truth is more interesting than a monster. Ray Bennett fixed boat engines down at the marina, and he was good at it, and he was the kind of man who measured himself entirely by what he provided. That was his whole spine. A man works, a man pays, a man keeps a roof up. That was the sum of him, and in a good life, it might have been enough. But Ray had married a woman carrying another man's child, and Harlow Cove never once let him forget it. I heard them, at the marina, at the diner, the men he worked beside his whole life. Raising another guy's kid. More of a man than I'd be. Even the compliments were knives. They admired him for it, which meant they never stopped reminding him it was admirable, which meant every day for 18 years the town told Ray Bennett that I was a weight on his back that a lesser man would have dropped. And a certain kind of pride, when you rub it that way long enough, doesn't get stronger. It gets mean. He didn't start out throwing money at me. He started out just counting it, quietly, in front of me, so I'd know. Over the years, the counting got louder. By the time I was 17, he'd stopped pretending it was about anything but the same ledger I kept in my own head, except his had a due date on it, and the due date was my 18th birthday, the exact day the state of Maine said he was no longer legally required to house the mistake. He told me that once, flat, over dinner. 18, he said, and we're square. I said okay. I was already making other plans. My mother, Susan, is the hardest person in this story to talk about, because she's the one I still love in a way that hurts. She wasn't cruel. She was afraid, which in a house like ours turned out to be a kind of cruelty with better manners. She had married Ray at 22, 6 months along and terrified after the story she told me, which was that my real father had died at sea before I was born. drowned off a trawler in a storm. She told it the same way every time, word for word, which as a kid I thought meant it was true, and as a teenager I started to realize meant it was rehearsed. She kept the peace in that house by never, ever taking my side out loud. When Ray counted money at me, she looked at her plate. When he called me the mistake, and he did, more than once, right there at the table, she'd flinch, and then she'd pass the potatoes. Once, when I was 15, I asked her point blank why she let him talk about me that way. She got very still, and she said, "He kept us, Hannah. You don't understand what it is to have nowhere to go." And I remember thinking, I'm 15, Mom, and I already understand that better than you think. That was the night I stopped waiting for her to save me. Not with anger. I just quietly took her off the list of people who might. It's a strange grief, deciding your own mother isn't coming. You don't cry about it. You just get a little older in an afternoon. I loved her. I still do. But I stopped expecting her to stand up, and that turned out to be the most important thing I ever learned to stop expecting. The bakery was the first place I ever felt like I wasn't a line item. Marchetti's Bakery, on the corner of Water Street, run by Gloria Marchetti, who was 60 and built like a fire plug and had opinions about everything, including me. She hired me at 16 to scrub pans, and by 17 I was doing the early proof, in at 4 a.m., shaping loaves in the dark while the town slept. Gloria paid me fairly and fed me constantly, and never once made me feel like the feeding was a favor she was keeping track of. The first morning she pushed a warm roll across the counter and said, "Eat, you're too skinny." I almost cried into the flour because no one had ever handed me food without it being math. I didn't tell her that. I just ate the roll. But something in me started to unclench in that bakery, in the warm dark, with my hands in the dough. I started to think, very carefully, like a person testing ice, that maybe I wasn't actually worth less than everyone else. Maybe I'd just been raised in a house that priced me wrong. Gloria is the one who taught me the thing that saved my life, though neither of us knew it at the time. She said it about bread, but I heard it about everything. She said, "You can't rush a rise, honey. You give it the time it needs or you get a brick. Some things are only ready when they're ready." I was not ready yet. But I was rising. And 2 floors above the bakery, in a dusty crawlspace I had no reason to ever go into, a shoebox had been waiting for me for 16 years to be ready to find it. Here is what I knew about my real father for the first 16 years of my life. His name was never spoken. He had died before I was born, drowned off a fishing boat, and my mother had grieved him and moved on and married Ray, and that was the whole of it, a closed door with a sad little plaque on it. I used to build him up in my head the way you do with a dead parent you never met. I decided he'd been kind. I decided he'd have liked me. On bad nights, when Ray was counting, I'd lie in bed and tell myself that somewhere in the ground was a man who would have wanted me for free. It was a child's comfort, and I clung to it. What I didn't know, what nobody tells you when they hand you a clean, closed story, is that the neat ones are the lies. Real grief is messy and specific and full of names. My mother's story had no name in it. No boat's name, no town, no date I could ever find in any record, and for years I didn't notice the hole where those details should be, because when you're small, you don't audit your mother. You just believe her. I believed her until I was 16 years old, and I climbed into the crawlspace above the bakery storeroom to chase a roof leak for Gloria, and my flashlight caught the corner of a shoebox that did not belong to Gloria, tied with kitchen twine gone brittle with age, with my mother's maiden name written on the lid in a man's handwriting I had never seen. Remember that box. Everything turns on what was inside it. I want to be careful about how I tell this next part, because it's the hinge of my whole life, and I've had to piece the full story together since. The shoebox in that crawl space was full of letters, dozens of them over years, all in the same man's handwriting, all addressed to my mother, but not to the bakery. They were addressed to our house, Ray's house, sent from a naval postal address and then from ports I'd never heard of. Norfolk and Rota and Sasebo. And across the front of every single one, in red ink, in Ray Bennett's blocky mechanics print, was stamped or scrawled the same two words: return to sender. He hadn't thrown them away. That's the part I still turn over at night. He'd sent them back. For years, a man had written letters to my mother, and for years, Ray had intercepted them and marched them back to the post office and mailed them away again. And at some point, I found this one near the bottom, the twine cutting it off from the rest. My mother had gotten hold of a batch of them herself and hidden them at the bakery, above the storeroom, where Ray would never look, and where a 16-year-old chasing a roof leak would find them by pure blind luck. I sat in that crawl space with the dust and the cold, and I opened the oldest one with shaking hands, and it began, "Dear Susie, I don't know if you got my last one. I don't understand why you won't write back. Please just tell me if she's okay. Please just tell me her name." The letter was signed David. My father, who died at sea before I was born, was asking a woman who'd told me he was dead to please just tell him my name. I did not confront my mother. I want to be honest about why, because it wasn't nobility. It was strategy. And it was fear. I was 16. If I breathed a word, Ray would find the letters, and the letters would vanish, and I'd be right back inside the closed story with no door. So I did the coldest, most careful thing I have ever done. I copied down the return address from the most recent letter, a P.O. box in a town in Nova Scotia, and I put the box back exactly as I'd found it, twine and dust and all, and I told no one. Then I bought a stamp with bakery money, and I sat at the little desk in the back where Gloria did her invoices, and I wrote to a dead man. I didn't know what to say to 18 years of returned letters. In the end, I kept it short, because anything longer would have broken me. I wrote, "My name is Hannah. I think you're my father. I'm 16. I'm alive and I'm okay, and no one told me you were looking. If you want to write back, don't write to the house. Write to the bakery." And I gave the address, and I walked to the post office myself, and I mailed it, and then I threw up behind the building, quietly, and went back to work. For 3 weeks I got to the bakery mail before Gloria every morning. Nothing. I told myself he was dead after all, or didn't care, or that Nova Scotia was a made-up place. And then, on a Tuesday in November, in the 4 a.m. dark, there was an envelope in the slot addressed to me in the handwriting from the crawl space, and my hands shook so hard I couldn't open it. His first letter back was 4 pages long, and I have it memorized. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't rage about the years. He just, very gently, told me the truth, the way you'd approach a spooked animal. He and my mother had been together the summer before he shipped out with the Merchant Marine. She wrote him once to say she was pregnant, and then the letters from her stopped, and every letter he sent came back marked returned. And after a year, her mother told him over the phone that Susan had lost the baby and married someone else and wanted him gone for good. He'd believed it. What else could he do? He was 24 and at sea, and a whole family was telling him to disappear. So he did. But he never fully bought it, he wrote, because a man knows the difference between a door closing and a door being held shut, and so once a year, every year, on the birthday he'd calculated the baby would have had, he mailed one more letter to that house, just in case. 18 letters, one a year, all returned. He was writing to a daughter he'd been told didn't exist, on the off chance that she did. Over the next year and a half we wrote back and forth in secret, and slowly, carefully, I got a father. Not a hero, not a rescue. A real, ordinary, weathered man who fished and fixed nets and lived small, and wrote like he was afraid I'd disappear if he pressed too hard. He wasn't rich. He wasn't going to sweep in and change my life with money. He was just mine, and he wanted me for free, which was the only currency I had ever actually needed, and the one thing no one in Harlow Cove had ever offered. Meanwhile, the calendar was doing its work, and Ray was watching it like a man watching a loan come due. The closer I got to 18, the worse he got, because I think some part of him had always half believed that if he just kept the roof up long enough, the town would finally credit him, finally call him a good man without the asterisk. It never happened. The asterisk was permanent. And a man who's paid 18 years on a debt and gotten no respect for it starts to want, more than anything, to close the account and be seen closing it. He began saying it openly. 2 more months and you're not my problem. You know what today is? 90 days. He wasn't even angry when he said it anymore. He was almost cheerful, the cheer of a man who can see the finish line. My mother passed the potatoes. And I want you to understand. This is the part that matters. I was not a victim waiting to be rescued in that house. I had a father in Nova Scotia and a plan and a sealed envelope in my locker at the bakery, the box of returned letters, which I'd quietly moved out of the crawlspace the week I turned 17, because I'd realized I might need them someday, and I would only get one chance to have them in my hand at the right moment. I knew what was coming on my 18th birthday. Ray had told me the date himself, years ago, over the potatoes. What Ray didn't know was that I'd been counting down to the exact same day. Not in dread, the way he thought, but the way you count down to a train you've already bought a ticket for. I'd even told David when it was. I asked him to come. Asking David to come was the bravest and most frightening thing I did in the whole year and a half of letters. Meeting on paper is safe. Paper can't disappoint you in person. But I knew, the way you know a loaf is proofed by the feel of it, that my 18th birthday was going to be the night the closed story finally cracked open, and I did not want to walk out of Ray Bennett's house into empty air. I wanted somewhere to walk to. So I wrote to David and I told him everything, the ledger, the countdown, the date. And I asked him, if he could, to be in Harlow Cove on the evening of my birthday, not to make a scene, not to fight anyone, just to be nearby, so that when the door opened, there'd be a person standing in it. He wrote back one line. I've been waiting 18 years to stand in that doorway. I'll be there before dark. And here is the detail that matters most, the one I need you to hold on to. I told him to wait outside. I told him not to come in, not to knock, not to do anything, until I sent word. Because after a lifetime of other people deciding what happened to me, I had decided that this one time, the moment would be mine to open. Not his, not Ray's. Mine. I would choose when that door opened. That was the whole plan. The sealed envelope, and the waiting father, and the choice I was keeping for myself like a card face down. All of it came due on a cold Thursday in November, at a kitchen table, over a birthday dinner nobody had really wanted to cook. My 18th birthday dinner was meatloaf, because it was cheap, and my mother had put a single candle in a grocery store cupcake and lit it without quite meeting my eyes. Ray came in from the marina smelling like diesel and sat down heavy, and I could feel it coming off him, the strange good mood of a man about to be free of something. Nobody sang. We ate mostly in silence. I remember cutting my meatloaf into small pieces I didn't eat, and feeling, underneath the fear, something I hadn't expected. A kind of steadiness. The steadiness you get when the thing you've dreaded for years is finally, actually here, and turns out to be survivable simply because it's real. Let me stop here for 1 second because I know some of you are watching this in a house that feels exactly like that kitchen felt, where you've been made to feel like a cost somebody's counting. I need you to hear the rest of this, so if that's you, stay with me and hit subscribe, because what I learned at that table is the only thing that ever set me free, and I want it to find you too. Now. Ray finished eating. He pushed his plate back. He reached into his jacket, and I saw him take out his wallet, and my whole body went quiet the way the bakery goes quiet at 4 a.m. He counted out a single $100 bill, slow, making sure I watched every second of it, the last payment on an 18-year debt. And then he did the thing he'd been saving up for, the thing he thought would be the cruelest, most final blow of my life. He threw it at me, and he said the words. Get out, Ray said. You're 18. I'm done paying for another man's mistake. The bill hit my sweater and slid down into my lap and then onto the floor, and the room did the thing rooms do at moments like that. It got very large and very quiet, and I could hear the refrigerator humming and the candle guttering on the untouched cupcake. My mother made a small sound. Not a word. Just air. Ray stood over me with his arms crossed, waiting. And I understood, looking up at him, exactly what he wanted. He didn't just want me gone. He wanted the picture. The mistake, crying, scrambling for the $100 on the floor, begging or screaming or falling apart. Some final scene that would prove the town right and settle his account with his own pride once and for all. 18 years of being the man who raised another guy's kid, and this was the payoff he'd been saving. The moment the kid finally showed her true colors, and he got to be the martyr who'd carried her anyway. He needed me to break so that his whole life would mean what he'd decided it meant. And that, right there, cutting my meatloaf into pieces I'd never eat, is the moment I finally stopped keeping the ledger. Because I realized his account and my account had always been the same account, the same lie in two handwritings. His that I was a debt, and mine that I had to pay it. And you cannot settle a debt that was never real. You can only refuse to pay it. So I did not cry. I did not scramble. I looked at the $100 bill on the linoleum, and then I looked at the man who'd thrown it, and something in me went very calm and very clear. I bent down and I picked up the bill. Slowly. Not scrambling. The opposite of scrambling. I picked it up the way you pick up something that belongs to you, smoothed it flat against my knee, and folded it once, and set it on the table in front of me where everyone could see it. And I smiled. I wasn't putting on a brave face. I want to be clear about that because it matters. It wasn't performance. It was relief. For 18 years I had been terrified of exactly this moment, the moment the roof finally came out from over me, and now that it was here I discovered it was survivable. That the worst thing Ray Bennett could do to me was so much smaller than the fear of it, and the smile came up out of me on its own, from that discovery. Ray's face flickered. This was not the scene he'd ordered. He'd expected the mistake to fall apart. And instead, the mistake was sitting at his table smiling at a folded 100 like it was a receipt she'd been waiting for. "You think this is funny?" he said. And there was something new under his voice now, something that wasn't quite anger. It was the first thread of fear, the fear of a man who's played his highest card and watched it not take the trick. My mother was looking at me like she'd never seen me, which was fair, because the girl who kept the ledger had just quietly gotten up from the table and left, and someone else was sitting in her chair. I reached into my bag, and I took out the sealed envelope I'd been carrying for 2 years, the box of returned letters, and I held it across the table to Ray. "Happy birthday to me," I said. "I got you something." He didn't take it. He just looked at the envelope in my hand like it might be a trick, which, in fairness, it was, just not the kind he was braced for. "What is that?" he said. Not really a question. My mother had gone completely still across the table, and I noticed, because I notice things now, that she was looking at the envelope with an expression that was not confusion. It was recognition. She knew. On some level she had always known this was coming, the way you know a tide is coming, and she had chosen the potatoes every single time anyway. "Take it," I said to Ray, and I kept my voice level, the 4 a.m. voice, the shaping loaves in the dark voice. "You've been paying for 18 years. I think you've earned the chance to see what you actually bought." And there was enough weight in that, enough certainty, that his hand came up almost against his will and took the envelope from me. He turned it over. It wasn't sealed with a lick and a prayer. I'd sealed it properly, because some things you want to feel a person tear open. He tore it open, and a stack of letters slid out into his big diesel-stained hands, letters he had held before, every one of them, because he was the one who'd sent them back. Dozens of envelopes addressed in David Alcott's handwriting to Susan Bennett, and stamped across every single face, in Ray's own blocky red print, the 2 words he'd written with his own hand year after year for 18 years. Return to sender. I watched him recognize his own handwriting. I watched him understand what I was holding, and the color started to go out of his face. "I found them 2 years ago," I said. "Above the storeroom at the bakery. Mom hid a batch of them there, I think, before she lost her nerve. But the handwriting on the front is yours, Ray. All of it. Every year, for 18 years, a man wrote to this house asking about me, asking my name, and every year you walked his letters back to the post office and mailed them away, and then you sat at this table and called me another man's mistake. My voice never rose. That's the thing I'm proudest of, honestly. I'd watched Ray my whole life measure his worth and how much he could make other people flinch, and I wasn't going to hand him a flinch now. You told me he was dead, I said. Mom told me he drowned, and that whole time he was alive and writing and you were sending him back. I let that sit for 1 second. Then I said the thing I'd been carrying under my tongue for 2 years. Quiet, almost gentle, which made it land all the harder. You didn't call him dead, Ray. You mailed him back to sender. Ray Bennett, who fixed engines with his hands and measured himself by what he provided, stood in his own kitchen holding 18 years of proof that the one thing he'd actually built his whole identity on, being the man who stayed, who paid, who did the hard thing another man wouldn't, was a lie he'd enforced with red ink. He hadn't raised another man's mistake. He'd stolen another man's daughter and billed her for the privilege. And in the silence after I said it, from the dark street outside, there came the sound of a truck door closing. My mother stood up so fast her chair went over backward. "Hannah," she said. "Hannah, what did you do?" And her voice was climbing, and I realized she wasn't looking at the letters anymore. She was looking at the window, at the dark street, at the sound of that truck door. She knew what it meant. Of course she knew. She was the only other person alive who knew the whole shape of the lie, and she'd just heard a piece of it walk up to the curb. "Sit down, Susan," Ray said, but his voice had no floor under it now. It came out thin, and he said it again. "Sit down," to a room that was no longer taking his instructions. I stayed exactly where I was. I did not go to the window. I did not open the door. Because this was the part I had promised myself 2 years ago in that crawl space, the card I'd kept face down. The moment was mine to open, and I would open it when I chose, and not 1 second before. So I let it hang there. The letters in Ray's shaking hands, my mother's hand pressed over her mouth, the candle finally drowning in the cupcake. And I felt, for the first time in my entire life inside that house, that I was the one holding the room. Not the biggest, not the strongest, not the one who paid. Just the one who finally knew the whole truth and got to decide what happened next. I took out my phone. I sent David the single word we'd agreed on. Now. And then I folded my hands on the table next to $100 bill and I waited for my father to knock. The knock, when it came, was soft. That's what I remember. After 18 years and 18 letters and a whole ocean of lies, the knock was almost apologetic. 3 light taps. A man who'd waited his whole adult life to stand in that doorway and still had the grace to knock gently. Ray spun toward the sound so fast he knocked the letters off the table, and they scattered across the linoleum, returned to sender, facing up over and over like a hand of cards. Nobody moved to pick them up. "Don't," my mother whispered. To no one. To all of us. To God, maybe. I stood up from the table. I walked to the door. My house, too, for 1 more minute. My door to open. And I opened it. And there, on the step, in a canvas coat gone soft with age, holding a paper bag of something in both hands like an offering, was a weathered man with my exact eyes. I had never seen my own eyes on another face before. You don't know how much of you belongs to someone until you see it looking back at you from a stranger on a porch. He didn't grab me. He didn't cry, though his chin was doing something. He just looked at me for a long second, taking in every inch of a daughter he'd been told didn't exist, and then he said in a rough, quiet voice, "Hannah, I brought you a birthday cake. I didn't know what kind you liked, so I got the one with the most frosting." And behind me, in the kitchen he'd ruled for 18 years, I heard Ray Bennett make a sound I had never heard him make, low and broken, as the whole shape of his life came apart on the floor at his feet. I turned back into the kitchen with my father standing in the doorway behind me, and I saw Ray fully now, and the color was gone from his face all the way, gray as ash under the fluorescent light. He was staring at David the way you'd stare at a dead man, which, to Ray, he was. He'd spent 18 years mailing this man into the ground, and here he stood on the welcome mat holding a grocery store cake. Ray's mouth worked. "You," he said. "You were told—" And then he stopped, because there was no end to that sentence that didn't finish the confession. You were told to stay away. Told by whom? Told with what? Every version of the sentence just tightened the noose he'd tied himself. David didn't step inside. I noticed that, and I loved him a little for it. He stayed on the threshold in the cold because he understood without being told that this was still, for one more minute, not his house and not his moment. It was mine. "I'm not here for a fight, Ray," David said quietly. "I'm not here for you at all. I got a letter 2 years ago from a girl who signed it. I think you're my father. I've been waiting on her word ever since. That's all. I just came when she called." And my mother, who had passed the potatoes for 18 years, finally broke her silence at the exact moment it could no longer save anyone, and said the truest and most useless thing she'd ever said. "David," she whispered, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." And I stood in the middle of the three of them, the man who'd stolen me, the man I came from, the mother who'd let it happen, and I understood that now, finally, I had to choose. I'm going to pause for one breath, because this is the hinge, and it's not the one you think. You think the turn was the letters, or my father in the doorway. It wasn't. Those were things that happened to me, or things I uncovered. The real turn was still coming, and it was the first thing in my whole life that was entirely mine to decide. Because here is what happened in the next 60 seconds, the part nobody warns you about. The second there was a witness in that doorway, the ground shifted, and suddenly staying became possible. If you've ever been the one who was treated like a burden until the exact moment leaving got real, and then watched everyone scramble to keep you, I need you to comment, "I choose," and stay with me, because this is the whole thing. This is the only lesson I have. My mother turned to me with her hands out. Ray, gray-faced, was already recalculating, because Ray always calculated, and I watched him do the math of a man who's just realized the mistake he threw on the floor might be worth something after all, and both of them, the mother and the stepfather, in the space of one breath, started trying to get me to stay. "Hannah, honey, don't do this," my mother said, and the words came out in a rush now, all the words she hadn't said in 18 years arriving at once, too late, in the wrong order. "You don't know him. He's a stranger. You've got a bed here, you've got your job, you've got... This is your home. We can fix this. Ray didn't mean it. Tell her, Ray. Tell her you didn't mean it." And Ray, God help him, took the cue. The gray-faced man who'd thrown $100 at my chest 90 seconds ago cleared his throat and said, "Nobody said you had to leave tonight." That was it. That was his walk back. Not, "I'm sorry." Not, "I was wrong." Not, "I stole your father." Just, "Nobody said tonight." The words of a man rewriting the ledger in real time. Realizing the debt might run the other way now, that a daughter with a living father and a box full of proof was suddenly an asset he did not want walking out his door and talking. I looked at the two of them, and I want to tell you, because this is the part that's true and unheroic. For 1 second, I felt the pull. 18 years of wanting exactly this. My mother reaching for me, begging me to stay, choosing me out loud at last. It was everything the ledger-keeping girl had ever wanted. All I had to do was sit back down at the table, and I'd finally be wanted. I felt myself lean toward it, and then I heard the shape of it, under the words, and it stopped me cold. They didn't want me. They wanted me to stay. Those are not the same thing. One is love, the other is just a nicer eviction. Postponed. Because I finally understood what I was being offered. Not a home, a better position in the same ledger. Stay and be useful, And now be grateful too, and never mention the letters. And let the town keep its story, and let Ray keep his pride, and let my mother keep her peace. And in exchange, I could have the bed and the job and the dinner table, on the condition that I go on paying, forever, in silence, for the crime of having been born. That was the whole offer. It had always been the whole offer. And 2 years of letters from an ordinary weathered man in Nova Scotia had taught me the thing that made it finally, permanently, impossible to accept. That somewhere in the world was a person who had spent 18 years mailing 1 letter a year to a child he'd been told was dead, asking nothing, wanting only to know my name. And that this, asking for nothing, was what love actually looked like. And I had never once been offered it in this house, and I never would be. Because you cannot buy at any price the one thing that only comes for free. I looked at my mother's outstretched hands. I looked at Ray, doing math. I looked at David in the doorway, who had not said a thing to pull me toward him, who was letting me choose in the cold with a grocery store cake going soft in his arms, because wanting someone for free means letting them go if they need to. And I knew. It wasn't even hard in the end. It only looked hard from the outside. From the inside, it was the easiest, clearest thing I have ever known. I picked the folded $100 bill up off the table. I held the $100 bill up so Ray could see it, and I want you to understand that I took it. I kept it, on purpose, because refusing it would have been the ledger's move, the grand gesture of a girl still keeping score, and I was done keeping score. So I took the money he threw at me to prove I was worthless, and I made it mean the opposite. You said you were done paying, I told him. My voice was steady and quiet, and it filled that whole kitchen. Good. So am I. I put the bill in my pocket. Consider us even, Ray. You paid for 18 years of a roof, and I paid it back with 18 years of a kid who never once cost you a fight she started, who did the dishes and skipped seconds and got small so you'd never have to notice her. We're square. That's what you wanted. To be square. We're square. I don't owe you anything, and starting right now, I'm never going to act like I do again. He opened his mouth. Nothing came. What was there to say? He'd spent his whole life wanting to close the account, and I'd just closed it. And it turned out that closing it was the one thing that could destroy him. Because the debt was the only thing that had ever made him more than a man who returned letters. Without the ledger, he was just the person in that kitchen who'd stolen the most from everyone, including himself. Hannah, my mother said again, smaller now. I turned to her. And this is the part that still costs me, 2 years later, telling it. I loved her. I still love her. And I looked at her. And I understood that choosing myself meant losing her. And I chose anyway. Mom, I said, you could have written back to him one time in 18 years. 1 letter. You could have told him my name. She started to cry, and I did not go to her. Because if I went to her, I would stay. And staying would kill the person I had just become at that table. I'm not saying it to hurt you, I said, and I meant it. I'm saying it because I finally understand you were scared, and I forgive you. And I still can't live inside your fear anymore. Those are all true at the same time. Then I did the thing I'd promised myself I would not do, and I looked at Ray one last time, and instead of the contempt I'd rehearsed for years, I felt something closer to pity, because I could see the whole machine of him now. You know what the worst part is, Ray? I said. You actually did stay. You did keep the roof up. You could have been my father. The letters didn't have to mean you weren't. He was in Nova Scotia. You were here. You had 18 years and 100 dinners, and you spent every one of them counting instead of raising me. The town would have been wrong about you. You proved them right all by yourself. That wasn't a knife. I want you to hear that. It was the truest kind thing I could have said to him, and it was the cruelest, and those turned out to be the same sentence. He sat down. Just sat. In his kitchen chair. In the wreckage of his own certainty, an aging man who'd finally gotten his account settled and discovered that a settled account is just an empty room. and I turned away from him, for good, and I walked to the door where my father was waiting. David saw me coming and stepped back off the threshold to make room, out onto the porch, into the cold, still not presuming, still holding that ridiculous over-frosted cake. "I don't have a plan," I told him, and I laughed, a little wet. "I've got a job at a bakery and about $400 and 100 more in my pocket now, and I don't have anywhere to—" "You have somewhere," he said. "Just that. Not a mansion, not a rescue, not a fortune falling out of the sky. A weathered man with a used truck and a rented place on the water in a town in Nova Scotia, offering a spare room and 18 years of saved-up wanting. It's small," he said. "The room. It's not much. But it's yours as long as you want it. And there's no bill, Hannah. I need you to hear that part. There's no bill. There was never going to be a bill." And that was when I finally cried. On the porch. In the cold. Not because of anything that had been taken from me, but because of the one thing that was finally, freely, being given. Behind me, I heard footsteps. Quick. And I turned. Braced. But it was my mother. And she wasn't reaching to pull me back anymore. She pressed something into my hand and closed my fingers over it, and couldn't look at me while she did it. It was a photograph. Soft and creased from being hidden a long time. A young man on the deck of a boat, laughing, with my eyes, and on the back in her handwriting, one word, David. "He would have loved you," she whispered. "He does love you? Go." And then she stepped back inside and closed the door, choosing, in the end, to stay in her own kitchen. That was her whole redemption. It was almost enough. We walked to the truck, my father and I, down a driveway I'd walked 10,000 times and would never walk again. He opened the passenger door for me the way I'd later learn he opened every door, out of a plain, old-fashioned habit of care, and I climbed up into a cab that smelled like coffee and diesel and cold salt air, and he set the cake on my lap because there was nowhere else to put it. Then he got in the driver's side and put his weathered hands on the wheel and didn't start the engine for a second. "You okay?" he asked. And I sat there in the dark holding a grocery store cake with the most frosting, a $100 bill in my pocket, and a creased photograph in my fist, and no plan and no home, and no idea what came next. And I realized I felt something I had never once felt in 18 years under Ray Bennett's roof. I felt light. Not happy, exactly. It was too big and too raw for happy. But light. The way you feel when you finally set down a weight you'd carried so long, you'd forgotten it wasn't part of your body. "Yeah," I said. "I think I actually am." He nodded, like that was a good enough answer, and he started the truck. And as we pulled away from that house, I looked at the folded 100 in my hand one more time, the last payment on a debt that was never real, and I understood that it had never been an insult at all. It was a receipt. Paid in full. Both directions. I was free. I've been in Nova Scotia for 2 years now. I want to be honest about what that's looked like, because you deserve the true version, not the fairy tale. It was not instantly easy. David and I were strangers who happened to share a face and a certainty. We had to build the rest, slowly, the way you build anything real, with a lot of awkward silences and small kindnesses and the occasional argument about nothing. He is not a rich man. There was no fortune, no dramatic reversal, no moment where the ordinary fisherman turned out to be secretly anything. He's just my father, which turned out to be the only thing I'd ever actually wanted him to be. I work at a bakery here. Of course I do. Gloria wrote me a reference that made me cry. And I'm taking classes at the community college 2 evenings a week, and I am building a life that is measured in exactly nothing owed. Ray still lives in Harlow Cove. He still fixes engines at the marina. As far as I know, he tells a version of the story where I was ungrateful and ran off with a stranger, and in certain rooms in that town I am the girl who broke Ray Bennett's heart after all he did for her. The fortress held. It always holds. My mother and I write, carefully, a few times a year. It's not what it was, and it's not nothing, and I've made my peace with it living in that in-between. She chose her kitchen. I don't hate her for it. I just don't live there anymore. In the house, or in the fear. Some debts you settle by paying them, and some you settle, finally, by understanding they were never real, and putting down the pen. I kept the $100 bill. It's in a frame on the wall of my small room in my father's small house, and people who don't know the story think it's a joke, a first dollar earned, that kind of thing. It's not. It's the most expensive thing I own, and it cost me my mother and the only home I'd ever known, and it was worth every cent of that price, because of what I finally understood the night it hit my chest and slid to the floor. I spent 17 years believing I was a debt somebody was carrying, and that the whole job of my life was to pay it down small enough to deserve a place at the table. I was never a debt. I just learned, too young, to keep the books, in a house where the only love on offer came with an invoice. A child is not a cost. A child is not a mistake, or another man's, or anybody's. And no one, not a stepfather with a ledger, not a whole town doing the math out loud, no one gets to make you spend your one life paying interest on the crime of having been born. You don't owe anyone your existence. The people who actually love you already know that. It's the ones who keep reminding you of the bill that you have to be willing to leave. So if you're the one in the cold kitchen tonight, the one being counted, the one who learned to get small and useful so somebody would let you stay, hear this from a girl who kept the books for 18 years before she finally closed them. You were never a debt, and belonging that has to be earned in silence was only ever an eviction on a slower clock. You are allowed to pick up the money, settle the account, and walk out the door toward the people who wanted you for free. If Hannah picking up that 100 and walking out loosened something in your chest, comment "I choose" and tell me the ledger you're ready to put down. Somebody scrolling tonight needs to hear they were never the debt they were made to feel like. Subscribe to Hidden Family Revenge for more ordinary people who found out, in one impossible evening, exactly what they were willing to walk out the door to keep. See you in the next one.